When I was 7, I was playing in my grandpa's front yard. A random car pulled up beside me and a young lady with an older man pulled out a rabbit in a cage and she said, "Hey, you want to pet my cute rabbit?" Being the foolish and naive youth that I was, I approached the car, and I was within an arm's reach of the lady. When my grandma came running out screaming at me, I don't remember what she said, but I had never heard anything like that before. The car then sped off, and my grandma ripped me from the pavement and took me inside. I'm so grateful she was there, and I always think about how different my life would be had she been a couple seconds later. Knocked over a propane tank in the garage. Cracked the neck and it started off-gassing. It was between me and the door into the house, garage door was closed. Cleared the door about a half second before it ignited from the gas water heater's pilot light. Lost all the hair on my face and got a burn on the hand I used to pull myself through the door. House was a total loss, but we all got out okay. A robber got into my house when I was about 8. Luckily, my dog noticed and bit the guy's leg and wouldn't let go. My dad heard the commotion, ran downstairs to see the robber trying to go back over the fence, with my dog still attached to their leg. My dad had to pull my dog off this guy's leg because she wouldn't let go. Police were called, but the guy was long gone. Doggy is still alive to this day. A burglar got into my place the very night I moved in. I had heaps of stuff, fishing and camping gear, tools, collectibles, and various other personal belongings still in boxes, mostly in the double car poured out back. The place was 3/4 fenced in color bond, but one side had a somewhat dodgy wire fence. I heard my dog bark a couple of times at 2 a.m., but I thought nothing of it at first. The burglar foolishly pried open the downstairs sliding door to be greeted by a very protective German Shepherd, Pepsi, who was curled up on a futon. I had locked her in that night hoping to replace the side fence and just let her settle into her new home. She then let out the crazy growl and bark, not the usual, "Hey, there's a cat" type bark. I jumped up and ran downstairs, grabbing a big bamboo stick from behind the door. He ran and was going over the back fence, as I heard him yell out a blood-curdling scream. She had latched on pulling him back over. As I got to him I whacked him once with the pole and then she adjusted and tore his Achilles out. He was on the ground and couldn't move, just screaming in fear and pain. My dog stood her ground and would have ripped him to shreds at the slightest signal. He had piled up a heap of gear, maybe a dozen fishing rods, even a kayak and canoe over the back fence. He begged for me to not let the dog kill him. I said I'd call him an ambulance, but he pleaded to just let him go. I said there was no way he could walk. I told him to let everyone know this place was off limits. He managed to pull himself over the fence, crawling off into the night. He yelled in pain as he tried to walk. Never had any trouble again. Got kidnapped by an ex-boyfriend who was weirdly obsessed with me when I was 16. He said he was 18, but was really 22. He tricked me into taking a ride in his new truck to a store a few blocks away. Instead, he drove out to the middle of nowhere and tried to rip off my clothes while screaming and crying at me. It got dark out, but he still wouldn't let me leave. I was convinced he was going to rape me and then kill me in a panic, so I told him I loved him but that my mom found out how old he was and made me break up with him. That I wanted to hide the relationship from her, but that it would be difficult to do if I wasn't back in time for curfew, because she would ground me and take away my car. He was so ecstatic that he immediately took me back to my car. I hid from him for a few years, but ran into him at a gas station when I was 19. I swear I could feel my heart stop beating. Years later I heard he was caught in an FBI sting for online predators and went to prison. When my daughter was 14 she attempted suicide by taking a whole bottle of Benadryl pills. In the 20 minutes it took me to get her to the ER she couldn't walk or talk anymore. The nurse was trying to get her to drink some liquid charcoal, but she wouldn't listen to the nurse. I took the cup and was coaxing her into taking some. She took 2 sips, looked at me, grabbed my hand, then her eyes rolled into the back of her head and she started having a seizure. I screamed for help and the room flooded with nurses and doctors. I was told to wait outside while they worked on her. They put her into a coma and cut off her clothes. She seized for 3 to 4 hours despite being given meds to stop them. She spent a week in the hospital before being sent to a psych hospital for 2 weeks. She's 18 now and doing great. Seeing her face when she started seizing and then seeing her in a coma is something I can't get out of my head. A man stalked me until he got my morning routine down. I would wake up at 5, see my spouse off, work out in detached garage-type room for 2 or 3 hours, take our dog to the park, then work in the garden or house until my spouse came home in the afternoon. That morning, my husband decided he wasn't going to work. He woke up before me and left me in bed to sleep in. When he let the dog out, he noticed the door to my workout room was open ajar, but didn't notice anything else wrong, so he closed it, called the dog and came back inside to play video games. The guy had been waiting for me in my workout room. He had heard someone come out, so he checked the back door and it was unlocked. He came into the house with his shoes off, and his pants and belt undone, and had taken one of my knives from the kitchen drawer. When he rounded the corner to the living room, my husband and dog were there between him and me sleeping nude with the door open in the bedroom. They were taken totally off guard. The dog went into murder mode and my husband grabbed him and opened the door to get the guy outside and call the cops. Everything happened so quickly, it could have all gone down so differently. I worked in a major US city in the downtown area, but I didn't work banker's hours every day. I often worked double shifts and would frequently have to walk through very dark and seedy areas of the city to get back to my car at night. During my day shifts there was a group of men that hung around the entrance to my office building because they stayed at the homeless shelter, a block away, but had to vacate the building during work hours. I was a smoker and would often be outside and they'd ask me for a cigarette or $1. They were very friendly and kind, and if I could I would always give them what they asked for and make random small talk. One night I got stuck at the office very late and was walking alone to my car. I was on a particularly dark area of the street between 2 parking garages when, out of nowhere, 2 men in hoodies came up on each side of me. I wasn't naive or careless, and I was usually very aware of my surroundings in those situations, but these men startled me very badly. I immediately thought I was about to be robbed, or much worse, as they were carrying themselves in a very aggressive manner. Before I could really react or even figure out how to react, one of them grabbed me just above the elbow and sternly whispered, "You're safe, just keep walking. I promise you're safe." I was still terrified and now also confused. They started power walking me down the street, and, just as I was about to try to break free and fight, we came up to the entrance of a well-lit parking garage where a security guard was sitting. They suddenly stopped and that's when I realized these were 2 of the homeless men I was used to seeing during the day. They then told me that for months they had noticed I would sometimes leave very late and head off in a not-so-safe direction, so they had started keeping an eye on me. Turns out this particular night one of the local, not-so-well-intentioned, men had immediately begun following me. Praise the Lord, these kind men noticed it, as they followed me and knew if they guarded me, he would leave me alone. They walked me all the way to my car that night, and refused to leave until I was safely inside and locked up with the car running. I will forever be grateful to those 2 gentlemen for keeping me out of harm's way like they did. I was about 7 walking to my grandma's house after getting off of the school bus. It wasn't a long walk and I had done it pretty much every day. At this particular time a woman was standing on the sidewalk and walked up to me. She said she was a good friend of my grandma's, and that my grandma told her that I could come to her house for popsicles after school. I had never seen this woman before, and something told me this was dangerous. I told her no and started walking again, and she kept following me, telling me I didn't have to come over all day. I could just help her get the popsicles out of her freezer and I could leave. At this point alarms are going off in my mind, but being the kind of kid who was told to never disrespect adults, I got nervous. I told her I don't want to, and she grabbed my shoulder hard. I immediately screamed as loud as I could and ran off to my grandma's house, which was only about a block away. When I got there I was crying and told my grandma what happened. She and my aunt ran outside to find the woman but never did. My grandma told me I did the right thing and that the woman lied to me. I then got a full lecture from every adult in my life about stranger danger. From that day on, my aunt and grandma made sure to wait at the bus stop for me. It was Snowpocalypse 2010 in DC, which dumped 17.8 inches of snow on a city that wasn't equipped to handle it. We didn't have to work, so I had gone out for the night, was in my early 20s, with friends. I was walking home, slightly inebriated, and when to cross the street, I had the right of way. And then, boom, I woke up on the ground/sidewalk with a bunch of people hovering over me. I started freaking out, thinking I drunkenly fell, and insisted on getting up and leaving the situation. The bystanders refused to let me get up and informed me that I'd slipped on a patch of ice and gotten clipped by a station wagon as I crossed the street. Although I felt no pain, I instantly thought that I was gonna die and called my parents hysterical as we waited for the ambulance to arrive. I ended up in Georgetown Hospital for 3 days and suffered a fractured nose, 2 chipped teeth, a broken arm, and my face looked like I'd been literally mauled. They never found the station wagon/driver who hit me. Thankful to the bystanders who stayed with me that night. It was just before Valentine's Day, and one even brought me balloons in the hospital one day. When I was 10, I lived in a very small town, 1,200 people, and I lived 15 minutes from town in the woods. My dad and I were watching his friend's house, which was about 3 to 4 miles from our own, and just so happened to live closer to my friend's house. So one day after school I begged my dad to let me walk to my friend's house, and eventually he let me. There's not much in between the houses, and she lived about a half a mile away. At almost the halfway mark, this guy pulls up and asks me where a road was. I knew not to talk to strangers, so I just pointed behind me as I kept walking. He then started asking me questions like where I lived, why I was walking in the rain, it was barely drizzling, and I had a raincoat on. He then stops his car and says, "I can't let you walk in this, let me take you home." Now, deer in headlights is real, and I completely froze. I wish I could say I ran, that I fought, but I was basically a mannequin, kinda like an ostrich with its head in the sand, but my neck wasn't that long, and it was just mud. He asked where I lived and kept missing the turn. We drove past a restaurant and I lied and said my aunt was working and he could drop me off there. He said he would, but when he didn't, that's the exact moment I realized I was in trouble. I'm not going to get into detail because it's not required, but I'll just say that he took me deep into the woods, and on the way there I kept trying to figure out what he wanted from me. I thought about every situation from trying to get money from my family to making me a slave, but what he did to me I somehow didn't expect. It was like I thought that stuff didn't happen, I had never heard of it before. And that night I lost a lot of innocence. 16 hours later he tried to strangle me to death, but I kept kicking his window, and apparently he would rather have a window than kill me. He told me to turn the opposite way and start walking. He told me earlier that he had a gun and I thought he was going to shoot me in the back of the head, but he just drove off. Luckily, I knew where I was. Generally speaking, my bus went past where we were every morning. Yes, it sucked having to see it every day, so I walked to the nearest house that I knew had kids. It was about 5 miles away, and every time a car would get close, I would run and hide in the woods just in case it was him, coming back to finish me off. A few times I didn't make it, and every single one of them would stop and ask if I was one of the kids who ran away. Yep, I guess some kids ran away and people were out looking for them. That made me feel real shitty. I thought no one was looking for me. But I always shook my head and lied and pointed to a random house and said I lived there. I don't know how long it took me, but I eventually made it to the house with the kids and knocked on their door. I was probably another 5 miles from where my dad was. I remember when the mom answered the door and I blurted out what happened to me and asked to use her phone. She kept asking me what I said because she couldn't comprehend it. So I gave up trying and asked if I could use her phone. I tried my dad, busy, my grandma, busy, uncle, also busy. I remember thinking, man, they must all be talking with each other and planning out a fun day that I'm going to miss out on. I didn't know what to do and I started crying. The lady said she could give me a ride home and I agreed. I remember getting close to the house and seeing a ton of cars, some were cop cars, lights, and all. I remember thinking, this is why everyone was on the phone, they were finally organizing a parade down our road. I never got to experience many parades and secretly wanted one on my road. Everyone was backed up and what I didn't know then was that they were searching every car. Then I saw my dad, and I practically yelled, "That's my dad." And I guess he heard me yelling, looked right at me and said, "She's here." And I jumped out of the lady's truck and went to run for him, but the police grabbed me and threw me into the back of their car. I just wanted to go home. The rest of the day is a blur, I don't remember much, and the only reason I remember what I do, yes, every little detail, is because for over a year afterwards, once every couple of weeks I was forced to retell what happened to me up until that point in a courtroom so my memory would stay fresh, until he was caught. Besides the act, the hardest part was that everyone in town knew, so in a fucked up way, I was a celebrity. I couldn't ride the bus in peace because the radio would mention what happened to me and everyone would stare at me. Kids called me a whore, there were rumors that I was pregnant, that I asked for it, etc. One girl acted like my friend for months just to get me to talk about what happened. Then she stopped being my friend and lied to her other friends about what happened to me. It took me years to trust anyone again, and I was terrified of everyone. I remember my dad took me to the store and I stayed in the car while he went in. A man pulled up next to us and I was already scared, but then he came up to the car and said, "You're Gallifrey, aren't you?" I was so incredibly scared. I had no idea who he was, but then he introduced himself as Sarah's boyfriend, a woman my dad used to date, but that made no difference to me, he was a stranger and a man. I started to panic, but looking at me you wouldn't tell unless you got close as there were tears in my eyes, and I had peed a little. I was slowly rolling up my window and locked the door. The guy kept talking, about what? No idea, I could only hear waves. He eventually said, "Goodbye," and walked into the store. My dad came out and saw how freaked out I was and wanted to go fight the guy, but it wasn't his fault and I begged my dad not to. Years later I saw Sarah, not really her name, and she immediately apologized to me. She said that her boyfriend didn't know what had just happened to me and feels terrible for scaring me. Apparently he did notice. The guy who kidnapped me was caught a little over a year later and he's in prison for life. Sometimes I think, what if he did succeed in killing me and this life with terrorist attacks, COVID, Nazis in the streets, is just the nightmare before actual death. You wouldn't be able to find any of this online because it happened before the internet, and in a small town no one cares about. Sometimes I feel like I would like to write to him and maybe forgive him, but I haven't fully yet, maybe eventually. That was the scariest thing to ever happen to me. Thanks for watching. Keep enjoying our videos. Like and subscribe.